Welcome back to another Diablo 4 video. So Blizzard just released a massive patch for Diablo 4 with basically just sweeping buffs across the board. There are plenty of videos out there going over the entirety of the patch notes if that's what you're looking for. This is just going to be talking about the Druid buffs specifically. So let's get right into it. Now, there's a couple very powerful buffs here. A lot of this is just a little bit of an increase to damage numbers for the majority of the abilities. The one thing I really like about this, though, is that for the general leveling experience, let's say level 1 to 50, we potentially have some more options to choose from here. And maybe some of the builds like Shred or Lightning Storm that you may not have leveled with before are going to feel a little bit better to level with now. So first up, we have Earth Spike. So they increased Earth Spike's damage by 1%. It's generating one more spirit from 10 to 11, and then the Fierce Earth Spike modifier has been increased from 4% to 8% fortify your base life. So Earth Spike, it's used in Earth Werebear Pulverized builds. It's ran in kind of mid-game human Lightning Storm builds, and then you'll see it obviously in Nature's Fury Symbiotic Aspect builds. It's not really typically a focal point of those builds, but it is being cast from your Storm Strike or your Claw if you're running Staff of the Crone, so it is in those builds. So next up, Wind Shear, base damage increased by 1%. From 17 to 18%, and the spirit generated from 12 to 13. If you weren't already running Wind Shear for some reason, this isn't going to make you run it over anything else, in my opinion. Probably still pretty useless for most builds. I do like it sometimes, and if you're like really trying to be a ranged caster kind of build, you could potentially run it in like a Lightning Storm build, something like that. Claw got some pretty big buffs. So the base damage of Claw was increased by 2% from 20% to 22%. Spirit generated from 10 to 11. Then the Wild Claw modifier was increased from 10% to 15% chance to attack twice. Then also Fierce Claw, which is the poisoning modifier, was increased by 5% as well. So these are actually pretty big buffs. I mean, you're running Claw in Staff of the Crone, Nature's Fury, Symbiotic Aspect builds, so getting an extra 5% chance for it to attack twice is really good there. It's obviously very good in the basic attack Staff of the Crone builds as well. Just kind of massive buffs there to Claw, which I think out of all of the generators here that got buffed, this is probably the most impactful for actual in-game builds. Then Maul also got some buffs. The base damage was increased by 2%. Spirit generation was increased by 1 on this as well, up to 15. And then Enhanced Maul Fortify was increased to 3% from 2%. I really don't think this is going to make you run Maul again if you weren't already running it, but it's more of an option early game at least if this is something that you want to do. Moving on to Lightning Storm. So Lightning Storm's damage did not get buffed, but we've got some pretty nice quality of life stuff going on here. So the Enhanced Lightning Storm modifier, the size of your Lightning Storm is preserved for 6 seconds after channeling. This is up from 4 seconds. So I just put out a Lightning Storm build video, and you'll see in that video at times that when I'm running from pack to pack, you have to basically just cast Lightning Storm on nothing to try to preserve the size of your Lightning Storm so you don't have to re-channel it back up. You have to do way less of that at 6 seconds. Then they also increased the Immobilize from 8% to 12% chance. So, this helps us proc Earth and Might in that build, and just a little bit of an increase to crowd control as well. So Shred got buffs across the board. So the third attack of Shred was increased from 60% to 70%. Enhanced Shred, the first modifier, the healing was increased from 1% to 2%. Raging Shred, which is the poison, was increased from 51% to 70% weapon damage. And then Primal Shred, the critical strike damage was increased from 20% to 30%. So, the crit Shred builds obviously got much better here. The Blurred Beast poison builds will also be better, and they actually buffed Blurred Beast, which we'll get to here in a minute. Overall, solid changes, and I think Shred will also feel better to level with as well if you want to level with Shred at the beginning of Season 1. Alright, so then we have Wolves. So the active on the Wolves, this is basically where you direct them to leap onto an enemy. The cooldown of that was reduced to 11 seconds from 14 seconds. Then they also increased Ferocious Wolf Pack. On lucky hit, your Wolves' attacks have up to a 40% chance to fortify you for 5% base life. As far as Wolves in general, they still have tons of issues, even with the change to the cooldown, I don't think it's really going to matter all that much. If you're running like a dedicated companion build in the first place, you are running it with Pack Leader trying to reset the cooldown of your companions anyways. The wolves still basically deal no damage, especially passively. Their AI is terrible, and they just need a lot of work in general to ever be truly viable. You can run them early on while leveling, and they can be decent meat shields, but that's about it. One thing I would really like to see is I'd like to see them allow you to cast the actives of your companions while you're in Grizzly Rage form. Be able to actually keep the companion abilities on your bar while in Grizzly Rage form and cast the Wolves active, Poison Creeper active, stuff like that. So Hurricane's damage was increased. They buffed it from 97.5% up to 134%. Still going to be tough to make Hurricane work as an actual damaging ability. The investment in points just typically doesn't make a lot of sense compared to where you can put those points for the build that you're running. But it's ran in a lot of builds for the utility, so you're going to get a little bit more damage out of it in those builds. Rabies base damage was increased from 53% up to 76%. It's going in the right direction. Rabies is an ability that I would love to see actually be good. I haven't tested it, but I don't think this is enough of a buff for it to really matter that much. With that said, this, with the Shred buffs, with the Blurred Beast buff, maybe all of that put together potentially is a solid buff to the Poison Shred builds. But I think a lot of the Poison Shred builds out there were actually dropping Rabies completely because the poisoning damage just wasn't even good enough. Alright, so Cataclysm's damage was increased from 52% up to 64%. Cataclysm probably still needs a little bit of work, but it's slowly becoming a pretty good ultimate. A lot of things have happened. Cooldown's been reduced. We're getting damage increases to it. Things like that. It can definitely be ran early on, especially while leveling. Decent ultimate. So Lacerate's damage was increased from 400% up to 460% over 10 dashes. Really haven't played around with Lacerate too much. Compared to our other ultimates, Lacerate seems to be the weakest one, and even with this damage buff, I doubt that's going to change. One kind of cool thing that I don't know if everybody realizes is if you increase the duration of Lacerate, for instance, with, let's say, Calamity here, 25% with that, you actually increase the amount of dashes and the damage. So it goes up from 10 dashes to 13 dashes and 575% weapon damage. And then Petrify got a little bit of a critical strike damage increase. It went up from 25% to 30%. Really like Petrify. I think it's probably our second best ultimate behind Grizzly Rage. And this just gives it a little bit more of a bump there. As far as ultimates go, I would rank them Grizzly Rage, Petrify, Cataclysm, and then Lacerate. So Pummel, base damage increased from 140% to 180%. So Pummel is actually the attack that you do when you leap off of your horse. That's what that is. Pretty much irrelevant. I hardly ever even use it anyways. The novelty of that wore off pretty quickly for me. So Bestial Rampage. So the attack speed bonus was increased from 20% to 25%, and then the damage bonus was increased from 20% to 30%. So I feel like Bestial Rampage is a pretty annoying passive to use, just because you have to stay in each form for 2.5 seconds to then get the buff that lasts 15 seconds, and you have to kind of manage that. And truthfully, there's not that many really good builds that want to be shape-shifting back and forth anyways. I hope that ends up being a type of build that is really good at some point, and I think somewhere in the future, it could be very good. With that said, 30% increased damage and 25% attack speed from one key passive is strong. So probably the most significant buff here is going to be Nature's Fury. So this has been buffed from 20% to 30%. Nature's Fury is already insanely good, especially paired with the symbiotic aspect, reducing the cooldowns. Typically you're hitting something with a storm ability and reducing the cooldown of an earth ability. Having even higher chance for this to happen is pretty insane. You've already got symbiotic aspect, Nature's Fury, Trample Slide builds that are doing very well at endgame. You've got the Earthen Bulwark Detonator builds that are doing really good too. So this just makes those builds even better. So the next, Lupine Ferocity, was increased from 60% to 70%. This is already pretty good. It's a pretty solid alternative to running Earthen Might in a lot of the Storm Wolf kind of builds. It's also ran in some Staff of the Crone basic attack builds and some Shred builds. So next up, we have a few aspect changes. The first one being Runeworker's Conduit. Flat damage increased from 1 to 1.4. Runeworker's Conduit, this is the legendary, and I'm going to show you the old aspects before the buffs with the old numbers. So this is critical strikes with storm skills that you cast charge the air around you for 1 to 2 seconds, causing a lightning bolt to periodically hit an enemy in the area for lightning damage. Then you can extend the duration by additional critical strikes. So I haven't used this a ton, but with a little bit of testing that I've done, it does pretty considerable damage, but it's basically single target. I think that it can hit multiple enemies if they're like stacked on top of each other. But one of the big problems with it is you have to run it in an offensive aspect slot. I just don't really see it being worked into too many builds. With that said, I do want to test it and see how the damage feels. Maybe there is a home for it somewhere. Next up, we have Mangled Aspect. So this is when you are struck as a werebear, you have a chance to gain 1 spirit. It was 20 to 30%. It is now 30 to 40%. Terrible legendary effect. I don't even know why they're wasting their time buffing it. It just needs to be like reworked, or you need to gain way more than 1 spirit. There are way better ways to fix your spirit issues. And another problem with it is it's a resource legendary, so it has to go on a ring. So this also takes the spot of a potential offensive legendary. Next up, we have Seismic Shift. So this is Earth Spike launches in a line and has a cooldown. So the cooldown was 1.5 to 2.5 seconds. It is now down to 1 to 2 seconds. So this is another tough one to want to run. Again, offensive aspect. You have to really lose some power in your build to try to run it. All of the Earth Spikes in the line can actually generate you spirit, which is really nice. I don't really know where you would run it other than potentially like the basic attack builds where you're already proccing Earth Spikes. So when you proc Earth Spike with Nature's Fury from casting Storm Strike or Claw with Staff of the Crone, if it's casting the Earth Spikes in a line, maybe there's something there, especially now that Nature's Fury is up to 30%. Stack a bunch of attack speed, you're getting a bunch of these to proc. I don't really see it being run in any other kind of build other than that. And then finally, we have Blurred Beast. So the damage from Blurred Beast has been increased from 60 to 90% to 70 to 100%. And the way Blurred Beast works is while dashing, Shred seeks out nearby poisoned enemies, instantly dealing a percentage of the poisoning damage to them. So again, this paired with all of the other buffs to that build, Rabies getting a buff, if that's going to be good enough, all the Shred buffs with this buff as well. I think all that together is going to be a pretty nice increase for the Poison Shred Werewolf builds. I think one of the big takeaways from this entire thing is that for the time being, Grizzly Rage has not been touched. So Grizzly Rage with all of the corresponding aspects, Dire Wolf, all that stuff is still in the game, exactly as powerful as it's ever been. With that said, this was just a gigantic buff patch. So it would have been strange if there would have been just that one nerf with everything else getting buffed. So that's going to about wrap it up, guys. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.